Hi, this is Lyle Levitt welcoming you to TribFest 23. I hope you're enjoying this weekend of big ideas and important conversations about the future of our state and our country. No matter who you are or what you believe, please be courteous and respectful to everyone around you. And no matter where you call home, thank you for being here. That's right, even if you're not from Texas, the Texas Tribune Festival wants you anyway.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So nice to see you all this morning, and I'm very excited about this conversation today. Gabby Giffords and Senator Mark Kelly are two of my personal heroes. I, of course, covered the aftermath of that horrific day in January of 2011 when Gabby was shot in the head outside of a Safeway in Tucson, Arizona. 6 people died that day and 12 were injured. I've since gotten to know Gabby and Mark. They both participated in a documentary I did about gun violence called Under the Gun. In 2013, after the Sandy Hook shooting, Gabby and Mark helped found Giffords, an organization to help put an end to gun violence and ultimately save American lives. Giffords has helped pass more than 525 gun safety laws in states all across the country. The organization was also instrumental in helping pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act law, which was the first federal gun safety package to be passed in the last 30 years. Today, more than 12 years after Gabby was shot, over 43,000 people in the United States die from gun violence every single year. Please welcome former Congresswoman and certified badass Gabby Giffords, along with her husband, Senator Mark Kelly.
Yay! Yay!
Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Thank you.
I thought they deserved a big entrance. Don't you think, everyone? As I said, I'm so thrilled to be back together with you all talking and proud to call you both friends. Mark, let's start with you if we could. You were in the military.
Yep.
Both of your parents were police officers. How did you feel about guns prior to Gabby's injury?
Yeah, not only was I in the military, my dad was also, before he was a cop, was in the Army. One of my grandfathers served in the Navy in World War II. And if your last name's Kelly and you're from New Jersey, like everybody's a cop or a firefighter. So, something we grew up with. And after, I spent 25 years in the United States Navy. I flew in combat in the first Gulf War. So, I was a hunter, not a lot now, but when I was younger. So guns were always a part of my life, and I didn't really understand a lot about this issue, to be perfectly honest, until after Gabby was injured in 2011. And then, with some, time study and some research, came to realize that all of us now live in a country that stands out in the worst of ways on this issue. Just the sheer number of individuals that get shot and killed every year, especially children. We don't compare to anywhere else. And so that was a change for me, over a period of time.
I'm sure. Yeah. And we're going to talk about sort of what's happening in gun policy in a moment. But I have to just mention, I don't know if any of you all were able to watch Gabby Giffords Won't Back Down. Last night there was a screening. It's just an incredible film. And as Gabby proudly told me, 100% are Rotten Tomatoes, everyone. So if you haven't seen it, It came out in March of 2022. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. But one of the most compelling things, I've covered you all since day one. I think we met when I was outside the hospital, in fact, Mark.
Yep.
And I think what is so compelling, well, Gabby, you're an amazing person, but was all the footage throughout your recovery. And Mark, I'm curious, I know you mentioned that you really wanted to videotape Gabby almost from day one. And I'm wondering, what gave you, the foresight to do that? And why was that important to you?
Well, first of all, you're giving me way too much credit here. It actually had a lot with a friend of mine that was just looking for something to do. Because a lot of people were reaching out to try to help us. And this good friend of mine in Houston, Texas, kept asking me, hey, what can I do? And I just had this kind of notional idea that maybe it would be a good idea to videotape some of Gabby's recovery and therapy. So I just asked him, I asked Robert, I said, just go out and get me a camera and a tripod. And then I just set it up and recorded hundreds of hours of video going through like some really, really challenging times.
Cried.
Yeah.
Yep, a lot of that.
But I think, Gabby, what was so remarkable was to see, I've always been blown away by your partnership, your marriage, your friendship, the teamwork that we saw. And obviously, Mark was a big part of your recovery. Can you tell me a little, Gabby, about that teamwork?
He is my best friend. He is so funny. I love him a lot.
I'm a regular comedian.
I guess that sense of humor, though, honestly, comes in handy even in the darkest of days, right, Mark?
Yeah, it could help. We've had some, dark days back in, 2011. Gabby wasn't. Most people that suffer this kind of traumatic brain injury from a gunshot wound do not survive. And then Gabby was in a coma, for about a week, with doctors not really being able to give us any idea about, how this was going to progress. But I knew one thing about Gabby Giffords, and that's she doesn't give up, and she's going to work harder than anybody else. I knew that.
You are remarkable, and honestly, you guys have to watch this documentary. You just will be so moved. And I know that Gabby has something called aphasia. And Mark, can you explain what aphasia is and how it's impacted both of your lives?
I'm not sure I heard the word before she was injured. And I talked to her neurosurgeon about it, and he immediately said that this is something she's going to be faced with, especially with a left side traumatic brain injury. And the kind of aphasia that Gabby has is the expressive, side, and it's just hard to find the words.
Hard to find the words.
Which it must be very frustrating, because intellectually Gabby is Gabby.
Yes, it's frustrating. I think you would agree with that.
What do you tell yourself, Gabby, when things are difficult? How do you keep going?
Move ahead, to not look back. I hope others are inspired to keep moving forward no matter what.
And I think you really do inspire people to do that. And one of the interesting aspects of aphasia is that Gabby, when it comes to singing and the words of songs,
The sun will come out tomorrow, so you gotta hang on till tomorrow, come what may.
And Katie,
that is so crazy.
The reason that is, you always hear this left brain, right brain thing, right?
Yeah.
And I used to think that was made up. There's certain things, certain things are on your left side of your brain, and artistic kind of stuff.
Right.
Like music is physically for a right-handed person. That's on the right side of the brain. And speech, language is on the left side. And Gabby's injury is on the left side. So that's why music is, and she did a bunch of music therapy. Now, I have to say, it's also fortunate that she has a pretty decent voice.
Yes. Yeah, that would be pretty miserable, wouldn't it, Mark?
People would have left about 30 seconds ago if she
But
didn't.
at the end of the film, you know, you're singing John Denver, you're singing Take Me Home, Country Roads when you're on your bike, and that was really a fun thing, and also must give you some joy. And you're right, you do have a pretty voice.
Yes.
So, but that
She
to me
remembers
is
every song from the 80s.
really.
He's on 8.
Not the 90s, not the 70s, the 80s. We listened to a lot of 80s music.
Take on me, take me home.
You sing that in the documentary too, but I thought that was pretty incredible. You know, also the doc charts your decision, Mark, to run for Senate with Gabby really at your side. It became, you decided you couldn't serve the people of Arizona, your constituents, during your recovery. Mark, you decided to step in the breach, and I'm curious how, you know, your decision process for doing that. You left NASA, you left the Navy, and you said, I'm going to run for U.S. Senate.
Well, that breach you mentioned is over like an 8-year period. So
Right.
It's not like I went from one thing to the other.
Right.
So Gabby was in the hospital. I had to make a decision whether or not to go back into space. I flew my last space shuttle flight as the commander of Endeavour while Gabby was in the hospital. As I'm rendezvousing with the space station, she's in brain surgery.
I know, that was
I mean, it was like it was just like
unbelievable.
this whole thing. And then, because of Gabby's injury, we made a decision. I would leave NASA, leave the Navy. She resigned from Congress. But that was all in 2011. I mean, I wound up getting into this business and making a decision to run. I shouldn't say it's a business, it's public service. And I've been a public servant my whole life. But it was really what happened before the election in 2018, where Gabby and I met this young woman who wasn't much older than my eldest daughter. It was the night before an election. It was a get out the vote rally. And she said to me, she said, hey, my son has Down syndrome, and I am terrified that he's going to lose his health insurance. Would you please consider running for the U.S. Senate? And that, like, one conversation, like, had a big impact on me. That she realized there was a direct connection between her kid, possibly who really needs health insurance, of losing it, and who was in this U.S. Senate seat. So at that point, I considered it, and it wasn't 6 weeks later that I announced I was going to run for Senate.
Someone in the doc, I think it was a newspaper reporter, said a lot of being a politician didn't come easily to you. You're not exactly the biggest schmoozer I've ever met, Mark.
I am not Gabby Giffords.
Right. And Gabby obviously gets, and still does, gets her energy from people.
Right.
I was going to say you don't
I'm a
really
guy
like
who
people,
flew
but that's
airplanes.
not true.
Yeah,
You like people.
Oh, I do. I do. I mean, but I'm not your typical politician. I spent 25 years, like, in the cockpit of an airplane and in the cockpit of the space shuttle. And an engineer. I'm one of the few engineers in the United States Senate. I think there's 3 of us. And there's one scientist. You know, most folks come from a different kind of background.
And what was the hardest part of adjusting to being a politician, given your career
Well, it's really
history?
hard. It's hard work, but it's a different kind of work. Like, you see Gabby running around Tucson and meeting people, and that gives her a lot of energy. She could do that for hours and days and days. You know, for me, where I do like it, I do enjoy it, but it's an effort to be on, you know, like that, hour after hour, day after day, in a campaign.
Yeah.
You know, especially. And I really do like the job. The job serving in the House or the Senate, all-consuming. I mean, it is 24/7. But the impact that you can have on the lives of not only your constituents, but the American people is much more impactful than what I did before.
Gabby, how do you feel about Mark's election to the United States Senate?
I'm proud of him.
I know that
Gabby's my biggest supporter.
and she's also a bit of a coach, because during the film, when you were starting to do sort of like campaign announcements, You were not really using your hands. Gabby was showing you how to be more expressive. She was saying slow down in terms of your delivery. Right. So she was, in a way, your little political consultant on the side.
She's still my best coach. Yeah.
Showing up.
And you know what? I don't even have to pay her. The best part.
Free, yes.
I get this free
The
coaching
advice
from
is free.
the expert.
You've said you don't want to make gun safety the focus of your platform, and Arizona has some of the most permissive gun laws in the country. So I'm curious, Mark, how frustrating is it for you, given what you've witnessed firsthand, to live in a state that isn't necessarily sympathetic to your personal experience, and how have you had to navigate the conversation around guns with constituents who feel very strongly in their right to bear arms?
Well, we also have constituents, especially moms, all across the state that realize that when they send their kids to school every day, they are at risk of those kids not coming home. And that's true whether you're in Arizona or Alaska or New York. I mean, it does not matter where you live in this country. And I've met a lot of these moms that have lost their children. Gabby has. I mean, over and over and over again. And the legislation and the change that we have and others have proposed is very popular. It's popular with the American people. But we've been up against, for decades, a force that has tremendous resources, financial resources, get involved in elections. And the gun lobby, the gun industry, gun manufacturers have been very powerful. Now that has changed. Gabby and I started an organization that she now runs called Giffords that has worked across the country to bring common sense laws to legislatures, as you mentioned before we came out, 525 pieces of legislation. Pass safer, stronger gun laws. But it's not only that, it's the stuff we've defeated. Even in places like, Texas, that, there are folks out there that they want everybody to be walking around every day with a firearm. And if that happens, this problem will get worse.
How has the NRA been weakened? I know a while ago they were plagued by scandal, financial challenges. Wayne LaPierre was using funds for suits and boats, I think, and he's still head of the NRA. Have they been significantly weakened as an opposition force, and has anyone taken its place?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's organizations of that size that aren't run professionally generally, lose their influence. And that's happened with the National Rifle Association. I mean, it's just very clear. I don't even hear it mentioned in Washington, barely ever. I know when Gabby, was in the legislature when she was first elected to the state legislature, who was the first person that showed up in your office?
NRA.
Yep, first lobbyist that shows up. I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. And you ask who has taken their place, I would say at this point it's like gun manufacturers. So it's industry. Mm-hmm. And it's an industry with a lot of money. But I'll tell you what they don't have anymore. They just don't have the will and the interest of the American people behind them. And on these common sense solutions to this problem. It's supported by, we mentioned this backstage, background checks. Over 90% of Americans support, universal background checks for gun sales. Do you know what polls at 90% in our country, along with background checks?
Ice cream?
Yes. Ice cream.
And free money.
Ice cream and free money.
Really? I just guessed that.
Yeah, you're very good. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Wow.
Ice cream.
Who knew?
Yeah, 10% of people do not like ice cream.
I know that one of your approaches, which I've always admired, getting to the fact that a big percentage of gun owners favor stricter gun laws, right, is that you all have actually galvanize gun owners and not demonize gun owners. And you yourselves are gun owners and have always been gun owners. Tell me about why you wanted to have that approach.
Well, I think gun owners are an important part of this conversation. Gabby's a gun owner. I'm a gun owner. Responsible gun ownership, that is not the problem. The problem here is that we have created a system where somebody who is a domestic abuser or a convicted felon or has serious mental health issues.
Terror watch list, right?
Yeah, folks on the terrorist watch list. They can't get on an airplane, but they can go to a gun show and buy a firearm because there's no background checks. A felon can get out of prison, and where that individual can't buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer, they can go to a gun show in a lot of states and buy whatever they want. That results in our society being significantly less safe. It puts people at risk. Most of the gun owners that I know, they get that. We're gonna continue to fight because 45,000 people shot and killed every year is not acceptable.
Gabby, I know that June marked the 1-year anniversary of the passage of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And it was a big accomplishment, but there is still so much work to be done. Are you optimistic there will be further meaningful change on this issue?
I'm optimistic. It will be a long, hard haul, but I'm optimistic.
Can you basically, Mark, tell us a little bit, if you can, kind of just tick through or give us the Cliff Note version of the Safer Communities Act and the impact you believe it's had? Or is that really difficult to measure when it comes to preventing gun violence? That's hard. That's a hard thing.
Well, the good
to
news
say.
is we now do research on the issue.
Right.
But it's not the same as a lot of other issues. It's not like when you're trying to cure cancer and somebody gets better. I mean, in this case, you prevented something from happening. It's hard to measure. On that legislation that we worked really hard on, it's the first gun legislation that passed the United States Congress in 30 years, and it was bipartisan. Does a number of things. I'd say at the top of the list is if you're under the age of 21, there's a more comprehensive background check. It closes what's called the boyfriend loophole. So right now in our country, if you're a domestic abuser, if you were married to the person or had a child with the person or live with the person and you were arrested for domestic violence, you can no longer buy a firearm. But that's not true if you're the boyfriend who lives down the street. Mm-hmm. So it closes that loophole. It also addresses the issue of gun trafficking. So there's significant more penalties for that, and it targets gun trafficking. And then mental health. There are a lot of mental health deserts in our country, and what I mean by that are there significant areas of our country where you can't get any mental health care. So this is going to invest in mental health treatment, primarily and specifically in these areas that don't have a lot of options.
There's a new office dedicated to gun violence prevention that President Biden announced on yesterday, I guess, and it'll be led by Vice President Kamala Harris. What are you hoping will come from that? I mean, can we talk about some of these other measures that have failed? For example, what about an assault weapons ban, Mark?
Yeah, so what we want from this is progress, universal background checks. I mean, addressing this issue of assault weapons. I spent 25 years in the Navy. An AR-15, it was designed for a very specific purpose, and that's to kill a lot of people in a short period of time. And it was not intended to be the most popular gun in America, and it shouldn't be in the hands of irresponsible people. So we can make progress on that. We can make progress on the background checks issue. There's a number of things we can do, on gun trafficking, on reporting, on research. So having an office in the White House run by the Vice President specifically address this issue, if it's done well, and I expect it to be done well, I mean, it can make a real difference.
I'm working on a documentary about Oklahoma City, and it was interesting because we're looking back at Timothy McVeigh. And one of the animating motivators for him to blow up the federal building, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, was in fact President Clinton's assault weapons ban. And I was sort of working on this, and I found it chilling and worrisome that if that is implemented again, it will galvanize right-wing extremism. Any concern about that?
Well, I mean, we can't let criminals, terrorists in our society dictate and stop us, really stop us from doing the right thing to protect people. So we should make progress, and then when we've got to be aware that that's a possibility, and then take the steps to mitigate against that.
Do you think this whole notion that the NRA has perpetrated for years, and I think it was in our documentary that you all were in, and I saw it in this this more recent one, about the way to handle a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, has the air been taken out of that argument? You look at Uvalde, and there were many, many, many good guys with guns in that situation. Are gun rights advocates still using that, what we now know is faulty logic?
Safeway store.
Yes. And what Gabby's referring to is where she was shot, where 6 individuals were killed, 12 others injured in 15 seconds. There was what you just talked about. There was a good guy with a gun there who had a firearm on him. He was interviewed afterwards. And he was in the Walgreens next door, and he hears the gunshots. He runs out, and this is his side of the story. He said that he nearly pulled out his gun and shot the person that had tackled the shooter and then picked up the shooter's firearm. So after the gun was dropped, one of the bystanders, picked up the firearm. So we almost had this horrific mass shooting, this horrific tragedy, immediately followed by a horrific accident. So this idea that I've flown airplanes in combat, getting shot at, I've been shot at a bunch of times in an airplane. It is not what people expect. Things happen very fast. Police officers have to deal with this all the time, this incredibly dynamic situation.
And they're incredibly well-trained.
And they're well-trained. I am 100% convinced that is not the solution to this problem. You'll have more accidents. The idea that if everybody's armed, I think if everybody's armed, nobody is really, safe. There are situations where somebody will be successful, but more than that, we'll have more accidents.
And so I'm assuming that the idea of arming teachers is not something that you support.
I do not.
What about hardening schools, increasing security?
Katie, you have kids. I have kids. We now have a 2-year-old granddaughter. All the evidence.
And she actually has already experienced a lockdown at her daycare center?
Yeah, our 2-year-old granddaughter already. She's at a daycare, central Tucson, near the University of Arizona. There was a shooting of a professor, and her school got locked down. She wasn't yet 2. What we are doing to these kids, and it's not just about the kids that are getting shot and killed, and the trauma that happens in a classroom or a school when a mass shooter shows up. It's also the rest of the kids that have to experience their childhood going from, one lockdown drill to the next. And sometimes they become real, right? Sometimes they're, this is the drill, and sometimes it's not the drill, just the emotional and psychological impact and the PTSD, just among my Senate colleagues, just talking about their, one senator talking about their grandson who didn't want to go to school because they had a real lockdown.
And you think about the mental health crisis we're having in our country, compounded by the fact that I think I read 1 in 6 Americans has witnessed a mass shooting, defined by the shooting of 4 people or more. I mean, it's just incredible how ubiquitous and commonplace these shootings have become. Chris
And then
Murphy.
the number of Americans that just know somebody who's been shot. I mean, you asked that question in the UK. Oh yeah, we were in a classroom in Albuquerque of a bunch of teenagers, and usually when I ask this question, how many individuals, like if we did this in this room, how many individuals? You can't say Gabby. How many individuals in this room know somebody who's been shot? Look at the number of hands that went up, Katie. That's probably in this class. It looks like about 20% in here. I would say in general, it's usually about half. But you ask that question in a European country, that number is 0. Because I've done it a number of times. Nobody's hand goes up. And, I mean, you say 1 in 6? I didn't know that. The statistics are staggering. It used to be that, one of the most likely causes of death for a kid was a car accident. Now, those lines have crossed, where the number of deaths for especially teenagers in cars has gone down, the likelihood of getting killed with a firearm has gone up. And the reason is we take very seriously transportation safety. There's a whole, organization of the federal government that does that. And we make cars safer.
And the CDC was able to study it as a public health issue, and that was prohibited. Now it's back to studying gun violence as a public health issue, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That didn't happen by accident.
I have a question, Mark. I know that Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who's done so much great work on this issue, and I know you've helped him, he once said, I don't remember if I was interviewing him or watching him, and he said, guns have become a proxy for so many other issues in this divided country. And I'm wondering, do you ever see a time where people can come together, we can respect gun owners and their Second Amendment rights, which a well-regulated militia, I'm not sure how that translates to 2023, but that's a different subject. But where we can respect gun owners, but this love affair, this slippery slope mentality that you challenge anything about gun ownership or gun purchasing, that we can come to some kind of understanding, because, I have been covering this issue forever. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do a documentary. Is this love affair and this misplaced loyalty to guns and even weapons of war, are we ever going to be able to loosen that grip on our country?
I think we started about a year and a half ago with a core group of Democrats and Republicans, and we worked really hard on this to get that legislation passed. And where it was about 17 Republican members of the Senate voted for this legislation. They know this is the right thing to do. They know it'll make communities safer. And that is progress. It's not everything that I would have wanted in the legislation, or Chris would, but it is a step forward. And I think one of the best things about that is we had 17 Republicans who passed that legislation. They might have gotten a little bit of pushback, but they probably also got a lot of thanks, from the folks that they represent. Especially moms who have to send their kids to school every day, for doing something that's going to help kids, keep these kids safer. So we can build upon that, and we are, just so you know, we are working on it.
Gabby, it seems these tragedies, it's just on repeat. You hear about it, and almost I worry people have become inured to them, to be honest with you. They happen with such frequency. Do you ever want to just give up and in your work towards stopping gun violence, are you ever just so frustrated you say, forget it?
No way, Jose.
Not at all.
No.
Never give up.
I mean, it's really true, but it is frustrating and exhausting. And Mark, I know that it's something that you're going to continue to pursue. What would you say to Governor Greg Abbott if he were sitting here? Last week here in Texas, 2 teens died, 4 others were injured during a shooting in El Paso. We've heard the stories, obviously heartbreaking, terrible stories coming out of this state. And he continues to loosen gun laws and claim this is a mental health issue. Now, by the way, I think that has been addressed a lot of times. People say, well, other countries have the same amount of mental health,
Of course.
but they don't
Mental
have
health
the same
problems.
gun violence. At the same time, I think earlier you were kind of opening the door a little bit to say it's not one or the other, that you do have to address both things.
I mean, Gabby, how many times have we met with moms that have lost their children?
Thousands.
Well, a lot. Certainly hundreds.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Gabby may have. It might be when you consider individual parents who have lost kids. It is a big number. And I would encourage the Texas governor to spend some time with those parents. And then I would also tell them what you just said. I mean, other countries have mental health issues. They don't have this level of gun violence. What makes us stand out is just the number of firearms that's in society, and that then have a way of getting into the hands of people that should not own them.
Federal legislation is one way to address this issue, but as I mentioned, all these states are starting to pass various laws to reduce gun violence. As you mentioned, 525 pieces of legislation or laws have been passed. Can you just talk to me briefly, Mark, about addressing this state by state, and if that has had an impact on reducing gun deaths?
Gabby, how many states have you been to this year? Like, where have you been spending your time?
Everywhere.
Everywhere, basically. I mean,
Hawaii.
Michigan. I think you've been to Minnesota a couple times. Colorado. I mean, Gabby spends a lot of time in state capitals.
Yes.
With her team, working on legislation that we often struggle to pass federally. 525 pieces of legislation will make an impact. It's unfortunate that we have to kind of do this as a 50-piece puzzle. And there are places you can make great progress, like the states I mentioned. How many times have you been to Michigan this year?
Twice, 3 times.
3 times in Michigan.
A cry.
This is sad. This can be a sad issue to work on.
Yeah.
And so Gabby's organization is going to continue to do that. And they're able to do it because they have the support now of hundreds of thousands of Americans, that want them to be out there, that support the organization financially, that help, like the gun owners for gun safety, part of her organization, she refers to as
The Bubbas.
The Bubbas?
And we have chapters. Gabby's organization, Giffords, has chapters all over the country. So we can do this state by state.
Well, let's talk about that because, I often post on my Instagram feed profiles and photos of the victims of gun violence and give their stories because statistics often don't have an impact on people. But when you see the faces of little kids and you see the faces of young people who are out on a Friday night or people at the Pulse nightclub. I mean, I could go on and on and on. It really does affect you. At the same time, I think people still feel powerless. They want to know what can we do? How can we get involved? How can we really change legislation? I'll never forget you telling me, and I often quote you all, that when you actually call your congressperson, they pay attention.
They do.
You know, people think, oh, I'm just going to call my member of Congress and nobody's going to answer the phone and they won't give a damn.
Right.
But actually, it's effective. So calling your member of Congress or your senator is important. But what else can the average person do?
Well, that, and let's think about this for a second. The average House member, well, a House member, represents about 750,000 people. It's a lot of people. A lot of them are kids. A lot of them spend a lot of, they're at work, they're taking the kid to the soccer game, they're doing all kinds of things. How many of those people you think actually pick up the phone and make a phone call into their representative's office in Washington, D.C.? That number is actually very small. So if you're willing to be one of those people, you can have tremendous influence.
Monday.
Oh, Gabby would, whenever she would get to her office on Monday, she would say, what are people calling about? I do that now too. Probably not every Monday, but sometimes I do it in the middle of the week.
Right.
And I'll be walking by the interns, going to vote or going to a committee hearing. I'll say, hey, what are people calling about? I was talking to one of my colleagues this morning, and what he mentioned to me was that a lot of people were calling about the wearing of suits on the floor of the Senate.
Right. John Fetterman's shorts.
They were calling about the Senate uniform. Like
Isn't
he was
it
surprised.
crazy what gets people riled up? And yet, I mean, it does get people infuriated, but the fact that there can be action on something like that and not more action on reducing gun violence and gun deaths, it's insane to me. I mean, priorities, people.
Yes, but I'm sure on the same day that people were calling about suits, they were probably calling about background checks. But he was surprised by just the number of calls. Hey, 525 pieces of legislation in dozens of states and federal legislation that's bipartisan, the first thing we were able to do in 30 years, that is progress. So.
I also wanted to mention, Mark and Gabby encourage everyone to call their representatives in Congress. But also, I'd like to make a plug. There are so many incredible organizations you can support or get involved in. There's obviously Giffords.
Go to Gabby's website, the Giffords.org website, and sign up. And you can find information about where there
what's
might be a
happening in
rally,
your state.
what's happening in your state, what legislation you can get behind, what you can call about.
There's also Moms Demand, there's Everytown, there's Brady, and I know you all try to work together because there's no reason not to collaborate and be competitive about these things. But there are ways to get involved, to make your voice heard, and also find out at the ballot box who you're supporting and where their position is.
Well, that's a really good point. So on this issue, there are a lot of individuals that tend to be on the other side of the issue, that do not want stronger gun laws, that feel everybody should be carrying a firearm. They vote on that issue. So what we need folks to do.
Well, there are a lot of single-issue voters on that side.
Yeah,
and
you could be, well, generally I like people to consider the whole person.
Right.
But you really need to consider where folks stand on this issue. That'll make a difference.
Gabby, it's been more than 12 years, which I can't believe, since this happened to you. And I'm curious, what have you learned from your experience over the last 12 years?
To be grateful for friends and family, and to live every day to the fullest.
Well, obviously, you're doing that. And Mark, what have you learned? I mean, you've witnessed your extraordinary wife never back down, face obstacle after obstacle, frustration after frustration. And yet, I think Gabby, your spirit continues to shine through every day and through everything you do. It is so unbelievably inspiring, not only to me, but I'm sure to everyone in this room. So
Right,
what
so-
have... No, really, I mean, I don't even think there's a word for what you are. I mean, remarkable doesn't cut it. I mean, extraordinary doesn't even cut it.
Superhero.
Superhero, that may cut it. You should star in the next Marvel movie, Gabby. But what have you learned watching your wife and watching just taking it in day after day?
You know, I would say that regardless of a big hurdle being in front of you, or a significant challenge, or something really bad happening, you know, either with you or in your family, that there is, even at the darkest moment, you know, there's kind of a light out there at the end of the tunnel. And you can, if you're willing to work hard and show up every day and just don't give up, you can really make a difference.
Well, that's a good way to end this conversation. Mark Kelly, Gabby Giffords, thank you both so much.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.